In this video, we'll take a look at the figures from Chapter 7 and go over some of the data interpretation. So in this figure, we're looking at mass of seeds on the x-axis and the total number of seeds per plant on the y-axis. There's a negative linear correlation between the mass of the seeds and the total number of seeds that the plant produces. That means that as the mass of seeds increases, the number of seeds decreases. So an individual can make a lot of small seeds or a fewer number of larger seeds. There's a negative correlation, and that tells us that there's a trade-off in life history traits. So you can do one of two things. You can make a lot of seeds that are small or a few seeds that are large, but you can't do both because we only have so much energy to spend, and that generates this trade-off. Here we see that offspring size and dispersal are correlated. So we see average seed mass here, and then we see different types of seed dispersal across the x-axis. So if we use either unassisted or wind dispersal, we can see that seeds will be very small. If they're going to be carried by the wind, they're going to have to be small for that to work. If we come over here and look at ant seed dispersal, we see that the seeds are slightly larger. If we look at vertebrate seed dispersal, we see again slightly larger seeds. Those seeds that are dispersed by scatter hoarders are slightly larger. Scatter hoarders are things like squirrels that take seeds and then go and bury them in different places. So what does this tell us? It tells us that life history traits are shaped by trade-offs. So depending on the type of disperser you're going to use to disperse your seeds, that may dictate and limit the type of seed and the size of seed that you can produce. Here we're looking at a graph that shows number of eggs and the number of chicks that are fledged. In this experiment, they added or subtracted eggs from a nest, and they looked to see the effect of changing number of eggs on the number of successful chick fledglings a nest would have. Now we see here a nest with 6 eggs in it will fledge more chicks than one with 5 or one with 8. So it's doing better than those two. But we see here this nest that has 7 actually have the highest fledgling success, the most chicks fledged there. So there's going to be a trade-off between the number of eggs you have in a nest and how many of those chicks will be successful. So chick survival is correlated with the number of eggs in a nest. If you share a nest with more other individuals, you are decreasing your overall survival. So birds with too many eggs cannot provide as much care to each chick, and that's why their survival decreases. The major concept that this graph is illustrating is the concept of optimal clutch size. So in this particular case, the optimal clutch size for this species of bird would be 7 because that is the clutch size that gets them the most chicks fledged, assuming there aren't other things that are involved. So this also brings us back to the concept of life history trade-offs and the principle of allocation. What they're doing in this figure is they're comparing temperate birds to tropical birds. And we do know that temperate birds typically lay 1 or 2 more eggs than other species that are very closely related to them that live in the tropics. Another thing that we know is that temperate birds experience higher rates of adult mortality than tropical birds. So there's an increase in mortality for temperate birds. The data at the top here show us that temperate birds conduct a greater number of foraging trips to feed their total clutch. So this is the total clutch of eggs. How many trips do they have to make to feed those offspring for that entire clutch of eggs? Temperate birds spend more time gathering food to feed their offspring. We also know that tropical birds experience high nest predation. So if you have a lot of nest predators, then there is a high priority to get your chicks fed a lot so that they grow fast. That will increase their chance for survival. So what we're seeing on the bottom graph is the tropical bird species make more foraging trips per chick. So the top one was just total number of foraging for the whole nest. Now this is on a chick-by-chick basis. So per chick in the nest, the tropical species are actually making more trips. So they are increasing what they are investing in each one of their individual chicks. Again, the idea being that these chicks need to grow fast to get them at a larger size so that they are not as prone to nest predation. This also means that they will have higher survival as nestlings because they aren't experiencing this predation, and they also will have higher survival later in life. So once again, we're looking at the concept of life history trade-offs. In some species, it may be more appropriate and more selectively favored for parents to provide more food to fewer offspring to increase their growth rate and then reduce their predation risk. And that's what we're seeing in the tropical bird species compared to the temperate bird species. In these data, some nests received extra chicks, some had chicks removed, and then the controls were unchanged. Chicks removed, controls were unchanged, 2 chicks were added. We see from the top graph that parents with more chicks also fledged more offspring. So if you have more chicks, you're more likely to fledge more. Then the question becomes, if having more chicks in the nest actually makes you more successful, which the top figure would suggest, why don't kestrels lay more eggs? These were artificially added. So why do most kestrel only lay this number of eggs when they actually could do better by laying more? Wouldn't they have higher fitness? And so the answer to that comes in the bottom graph, because now what we're looking at is not number of chicks fledged, but we're looking at the annual adult survival. The parents of these nests that had the control versus 2 chicks added or removed, what's their survival like? And we see it split up for males and females. But for both males and females, we're seeing that if we add more chicks, the fewer chicks you have, the higher the survival of the parent. The more chicks you have, the lower the survival of the parent. So once again, we're seeing life history trade-offs. In this case, we're seeing a trade-off between what we invest in our offspring and making sure we have fitness there, but also weighing it against our own survival. So if having more chicks really decreases your own survival and your own ability to reproduce in the future, perhaps laying fewer eggs and having fewer chicks in the nest is really the best strategy. Here we're looking at guppies, and we're looking at different life history features based on different predation risk, low and high predation risk. The first graph is showing us that when the risk of predation is low, males mature at a larger size. They grow bigger when there's less predation. In the middle graph, we're seeing that when the risk of predation is low, females invest more into their own body mass and less into reproduction. On y-axis, we're seeing percent allocated to reproduction, which is the total offspring mass divided by the mother's mass. So if she puts a lot into offspring and just a little bit into her own, then that would be a large number. If I put less into offspring and more into moms, then that would be a lower number, and that's what we're seeing here. So she's investing in her own body a little bit more than she is into reproducing. The middle graph here is showing that when the risk of predation is low, fewer offspring are produced. And our final graph is showing that when the risk of predation is low, each offspring is larger. So basically they're making fewer but larger offspring. So the overall concept here is several things. We have a trade-off between growth and age at sexual maturity and how much we invest in offspring that's all being influenced by the level of predation. If we have mortality from predators that's very high, then individuals will reach maturity sooner, but they'll also be smaller. And that's what we're seeing here. So if you reach maturity sooner and you're smaller, it also means that when you invest in offspring, there's going to be a higher ratio, because you're smaller. And then we're also seeing again here that we're making fewer offspring at low predation, but we're making them larger. This also comes back to the concept of R&K selection and ecological mortality. When ecological mortality is high, we grow fast, we are smaller bodied, we allocate more to reproduction and less to our own body, and then we have more offspring, and those offspring are smaller. This graph is just showing us that as age increases, death from these various diseases also increases. And really that is one of our definitions, or one component of senescence. Senescence says that over a lifetime, as we age, we will see a gradual decrease in our fecundity, so our ability to reproduce, and also a decrease in our survivorship, or an increase in mortality. And we're seeing that here with that increase in mortality. Looking at change in body mass over time, so we're looking at the growth. We see that frogs that are grown under high food conditions grow more quickly, so this is a steeper slope, so that's a faster growth rate. If we look at the blue line, this is low food conditions. They're growing more slowly because that's a shallower slope, so the growth rate is less on the blue line. With higher food, they grow faster. Now, the other thing we want to think about here is suppose a tadpole has to reach a certain size before they can go through metamorphosis. They have to reach this critical body size. And let's imagine that under the high food conditions, that body size can be reached at 100 days. So if I come down here, if this is the size it needs to be, I come down here, it can do that in 100 days if it's growing at this rate. If it's growing at the slower rate and it still needs to be this size, then I would have to come over here and drop down, and it would not be able to metamorphose until after 150 days. So it's going to take it a lot longer to reach the critical size it needs to be to go into metamorphosis. So the concept here is that food availability can alter life histories. Frogs that are under low food stay tadpoles longer, and that's risky to be a tadpole longer because they're very prone to predation at that point. They also have to delay maturity for quite some time, and if they delay maturity, that also delays their reproduction. And delaying your reproduction means that you might end up with a lower fitness because you start so much later than other individuals. The other thing that happens is if an amphibian matures at a smaller size and it's not going to grow once it's an adult. So once it starts reproducing, that's as big as it's going to get. Well, if being larger as a male or being larger as a female means that you get more mates or that you can lay more eggs or whatever, that also means that maturing at a smaller size can affect your future reproductive success throughout your life. So in this case, we could see that food availability could have a huge impact on life histories and success strategies. We're looking at data from snails in two different conditions. We have the no predator condition, and then we have the crayfish condition. Now keep in mind when they have the crayfish condition, it's just the chemicals from the crayfish. They're not actually eating the snails. It's just the snails are detecting the presence of a predator in their tank. The first one looks at the age at first reproduction. So at what age do they start reproducing? And snails that detect presence of predators delay their reproduction. They start reproducing a little bit later when they detect presence of that predator. In the second graph, it shows us that the snails that detect the presence of the predator will mature at a larger size. Their mass at first reproduction is bigger, so they're growing a little bit longer. That's why this is delayed here. And then they're also getting bigger. And this also extends their overall lifespan. Now, interestingly, when we go and compare those two groups and look at their overall lifetime egg production, what we find is that the snails in those two conditions are approximately equal in their lifetime egg production. If you have crayfish present, then this is a good strategy. If crayfish are not present, this is a good strategy. And those are both more or less equally good strategies. It just depends what environment you find yourself in. So the concept here is that predation and the risk of predation can alter life history strategies. If there's a risk of predation, we might delay reproduction so that we can grow larger, and being larger might eventually reduce our risk of predation later in life. But overall, when we look at sort of the lifetime egg production, it seems like both of those strategies are equally successful. Here we're looking at data from leatherback turtles over time, and we're seeing that there has been a decline in the hatching success. The top line here in the top data points is looking at hatching success over this 30-year period. So we see a decline in hatching success. We're also seeing a fairly close correlation between that and a decline in precipitation over that time period. So this is telling us that environmental factors can influence life histories. Here we see a potential effect of climate change on life history. If climate change does end up causing a decline in precipitation, then we might expect to see less hatching success for this kind of a species. Here we're looking at flowers, and we're looking at, on the left-hand side, mean flowering date over time. And what we see here is that the date that the plants first flower, so when do they first flower in the season for the year, it's declined about 7 days compared to the 1850s. On the right-hand side, we're seeing that the date that a plant first flowers is strongly correlated with the mean temperatures several months prior to that. So if we have warmer spring temperatures, we're going to get them flowering sooner. If we have cooler spring temperatures, they're going to flower a little bit later. Once again, this is telling us that environmental factors can influence life history. Once again, we see the potential effect of climate change on a plant life history. If we are going to see warmer climates and if spring temperatures are going to be warmer, we may see that the flowering time changes, and that could really drastically impact insect populations, pollinators, etc. So if these plants are changing what they're doing over the course of the year, and insects are depending on them, and birds are depending on that, and so are lots of other species, then those species will also be affected and would either change or perhaps not change and go extinct. Here we're looking at the presence of various species, birds, bees, butterflies, time of flowering, time of leafing for plants, and how many days early that has occurred. So a value of 0 here would be no change. If they were doing it exactly the way that they've always done it, we would have a 0 there. And you can see that we don't have zeros. These are all shifted to an earlier time period. Bird arrival, bee sighting, all of these is occurring earlier than normal. And again, this could represent the effect of climate change on life histories, where this climate change could affect all of these different species, particularly here, birds, plants, and insects. These data are looking at an experiment on fishing and looking at over time, over generations of fish, and looking at the change in their body size. We can see here in the top line, if we remove small fish from the population, what we do is we select for larger bodied fish. We're removing the small ones, we're selecting for larger bodies, and that's what we're seeing. But the other thing we're seeing as we select for larger body, we're also selecting for a delay in sexual maturity. And that's what we're looking at over here. So we're seeing, yes, they're larger, but they're also maturing later. If we remove large fish, we're selecting for smaller body size, and so we see on average the population size gets smaller, average individuals get smaller, and they also start to reach sexual maturity at a younger age. So here we're selecting for earlier age at maturity and smaller body size because we've removed the large ones. Here, because we removed the small ones, we're selecting for those individuals that have larger body size and are delaying their maturity till later. We have our control group. The population didn't change. We didn't put selection on it. It's staying the same. So the concept here is that we can also impose selective pressures on life history traits of populations. If we remove the large fish, we're going to see a shift in the population to smaller sizes and earlier maturity. And of course, what that means overall for the fishing industry would mean a lower lifetime offspring reproduction. These fish are smaller, and those small individuals often will have fewer offspring. So that gets us through the data interpretation for Chapter 7.